So we've discussed the civilizations that were in the Americas before Europeans got here. And now we want to look at how Europe was able to colonize and conquer these continents. And we'll start by looking at Spain. The Spanish come in, and again, we've noted that there were already large, complex civilizations in the Americas, like the Aztec and Inca. But very quickly, the Spanish were able to conquer these empires. We want to kind of look at what happened and maybe why. The people Spain had sent into the Americas to explore are called conquistadors. Conquistador is just a Spanish word for conqueror or explorer, and these guys were sent out to find places to potentially colonize or find gold or whatever else the crown might have wanted. A lot of the people who came over to become conquistadors were often young men, often unmarried, unattached. They didn't have a whole lot of things they would do back in Spain. Maybe they were poor nobility who weren't inheriting land. Maybe they were farmers who were hoping to get some territory or some fame or fortune for themselves. And a lot of the people we'll talk about came from sort of this group of people in Spain. One of the most famous conquistadors was Hernan Cortés. Cortés came from the Spanish countryside, and he kind of ran into trouble with the law a few times, especially in Cuba, where he tried to steal a few boats to go, do exploring and conquest. But ultimately, he came to Mexico hoping to conquer the Aztec Empire for the Spanish crown. And they had made a few allies and a few enemies while they wandered around in Mexico, looking at the different tribes and city-states. But ultimately, Cortés eventually finds himself in Tenochtitlan, where he meets Moctezuma, or Montezuma, the last emperor of the Aztecs. And at first, they seem to get along okay. The records are a little contradictory, depending on whether you're looking at Spanish records or Aztec records, or even between the different Spanish records. But it seems like Montezuma welcomed the Spanish first as guests, but ultimately Cortés turned against Moctezuma and had him captured. They held him for ransom. He ordered the Aztecs to give the Spanish lots of tribute in the form of gold and food and other supplies. But ultimately Moctezuma was killed. Whether it was by the Aztecs or by the Spanish is unclear. But it led to a huge battle between the Spanish and the Aztecs. First, the Spanish were driven off. Cortés was almost captured. But the Spanish will later rally a lot of their allies in the neighboring city-states like Tlaxcalan and come back and ultimately, after many months of warfare, take over Tenochtitlan, which ultimately pretty much ends the Aztec Empire. Another important conquistador was Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro was actually a second cousin of Cortés, and he comes a little later, again looking for the same things, fame and fortune. This time he goes to South America, where ultimately he finds himself in the Inca Empire. And the Spanish came and met Atahualpa, the Incan emperor, and they try, like other Spanish did, to convince them that they should be part of the Spanish Empire, or that they already were, that the King of Spain had laid claim to their land, and convert them to Christianity. But very quickly, this turns to violence. Atahualpa is captured by the Spanish and held for ransom, and they order the Inca to melt down all the gold in their temple and give it to the Spanish, or Atahualpa will die. And after they melted down all the gold, they killed Atahualpa anyway. And that effectively was the end of the Inca Empire. And all this happened very quickly, and one might kind of wonder why and how the Spanish were able to conquer these two massive empires so quickly. Historians have long kind of debated this. There's a few different viewpoints and maybe some advantages the Spanish had. One of those was technology. People have often pointed out that European technology was in a very different place from technology in the Americas, where the Spanish had steel, swords, and weapons and armor. The most metalwork people in the Americas had was gold or silver. The Spanish, of course, had firearms and guns. They had access to things like the printing press, which doesn't sound like much of a weapon, but it's easier to spread information like warfare tactics and technology. By the time Pizarro came in to fight the Incas, Cortés has already written his story of how he conquered the Aztec. Some historians disagree with that perspective. One in particular, Horace Mann, in his book 1491, points out that while the Inca and the Aztecs had very different technology from the Spanish, a lot of times it was on par in terms of tactics. Incan armor was woven, and they used slings to throw rocks, but those could be just as accurate and effective and defensive as a lot of the Spanish weapons. The Spanish also had horses. Keep in mind, again, there was no large domesticated animals in the Americas outside of the llama. It's pointed out that having horses gives you a tactical advantage. Although in the Inca Empire, where you have these high roads that go up and down mountains, not really as much of a case. Two other big advantages have less to do with technology and more to do with the situation in the Americas at the time. One is politics. Remember at this time that Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, had been forcing all of the city-states to send more and more tributes for sacrifice. So that's an ally the Spanish had, and many historians point out, and Cortez himself points out in some of his letters, that it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for the Spanish to conquer Tenochtitlan without their native allies. The Inca, as you'll recall, just had a civil war. So the empire was already divided by the time Pizarro comes in. So you have that political advantage, the situation that the Spanish were able to exploit. And then you also should not discount the situation with disease. Remember that as soon as Columbus leaves the Americas in 1492, he's already unintentionally spread diseases like smallpox. And already the Americas had been ravished with this disease and other diseases by the time the Spanish come into to conquer these territories. Remember that Atahualpa's own father, Huayna Capac, died from a disease that probably was smallpox. And you're seeing the population really get decimated. And so this huge population decrease really causes this chain reaction, this ripple effect throughout the Americas of loss of population and workforce and soldiers. And this is something that the Spanish had been immune to by and large, because Europeans, having domesticated animals, had long been exposed to diseases that natives had not. So you can sort of weigh and debate some of the advantages and disadvantages and whether some of these really existed. But ultimately you see Spain take over the huge swath of the Americas, from present-day California all the way down to the southern tip of South America. And the next video we'll talk about how the Spanish ruled this new territory.